So one of the things that Cheryl asked us to do was to come up with a definition of digital equity, but actually the opening slide, Cheryl, I think that you shared painted that really, really well. So totally agree with your definition that this sits as one part of a much deeper set of equity issues that we need to face, but focused on digital equity, particularly in the education sector. These are the key dimensions that we as a ministry at least are focused on. And I guess most people would understand, or most of the focus, certainly in the mainstream media, tends to be on availability or access and affordability type issues. And those are certainly key enablers. For us, though, I guess it's the other components on this list that have been really part of a key focus, so particularly for first-time internet users, but all younger students, particularly online harm prevention, I think is one of the key aspects of equity. We're exposing people in some cases for the first time to new forms of harm that they haven't previously been exposed to in such a way. So probably quite a key part of the mahi for us around equity is not forgetting about that, I guess. Skills for us has sort of two sides to it. There's the skills of those who are, again, first time or relatively new users of digital technologies, but for us in education, also skills of the workforce is still a key focus area for us, and we found this throughout lockdown as well, that even where you've provided all of the required technology and software components, actually workforce skills can still be quite a key barrier. Motivation and trust at our sort of whole of whānau or household level are still key issues that need to be addressed. Having said that, I think education does offer a really unique opportunity around motivation for people to get onto use of the internet and use of digital tools. And we've found that to be almost universal, but trust, on the other hand, is still a significant challenge for us right across the whole cohort, I guess, of people that are currently not digitally included. And the last dimension, particularly from a government perspective, I guess, has been some of the policy issues. And I won't bore you with all the details of that, but we have this sort of reasonably haphazard BYOD policy in schooling, for example, that obviously is leaving gaps in the system. Policy around where government should and shouldn't target intervention, and a whole raft of things that come from that. But I'll move on from there. I would also just note, particularly prior to the COVID lockdowns, we have been working these issues through in a series of pilots, and I won't steal Arnika's thunder because certainly what's been happening out in the east has been a really fantastic learning opportunity for us and them, and I'm sure Arnika will cover that in a bit more detail. So that was all nice and tidy until COVID hit us. And I guess, as you highlighted, Cheryl, in your opening slides, that's really brought this into quite stark relief, not just in education, but far broader. But just to put some numbers around this, and this is the compulsory schooling part of the system, so years 1 through 13. Of the roughly 800,000 students, our best estimate of numbers here was about 115,000 students were impacted in a way that they had either no internet or no device, or in many cases both. Certainly still issues in parts of Aotearoa where we have poor internet speeds. That mostly is a rural issue, but not exclusively so. Some real challenges around identifying those in need, and that remains, I think, a challenge for all of us going forward. There is no well-defined denominator to this problem in terms of those individuals or households who are not connected, for example. And certainly within education, the priority group for us during lockdown was senior secondary, and that's been, I guess, the context for that, I guess, is a constraint on resourcing. So you are then forced into making sometimes quite difficult prioritisation choices, but the choice that was made through COVID was to make sure that secondary students in particular were least impacted, and therefore that's where the priority focus became. Move forward. Most of you will be aware of this. It's been well covered in the mainstream media, so I won't go through this in lots of detail, but certainly the COVID response for education was to enable distance learning with a variety of different channels. TV broadcasts and hard copy I won't cover particularly, but they were there as a fallback, recognising that not everybody would be able to get online for a whole variety of different reasons in the time frame. So throughout both the first and the second lockdown triggered from Auckland, we're now at 35,000 devices that have been provided new into the system this year. And that's probably a really useful point in time reflection that we now have all secondary school students with access to a device in the system. There should be no reason for a secondary school age student not to have access to a device. Now that's not necessarily the same thing as a sustainable solution, but it is a point in time. And similarly, around 45,000 households around the country on a whole variety of different methods. Switched on safety, if you're not familiar with it, was a DNS filter we launched during lockdown, which, while not at the same level of sophistication as the in-school filtering service, does provide some basic DNS filtering. And the last, excuse me, last point on here was a different intervention for the tertiary sector, which was basically to fund tertiary institutions to do something similar for tertiary students. I just tried to capture, I guess, some of the key learnings, which hopefully these will be useful throughout the different workshops you've got this week. But the first one really states the obvious. But I would make a point, I guess, the wider state sector workforce is not generally that well prepared to work from home either. So as in the case of education, educators need to be equally prepared to support this from a distance learning perspective. We do have infrastructural issues here in Aotearoa. Telcos, for understandable commercial reasons, have built infrastructure in areas where there are paying customers. And by and large, the groups that we're targeting have not been self-evidently, I guess, paying customers. So there are still capacity and availability constraints. Interesting for us, I guess, was the notion of targeting households. So where we've provided internet connectivity, that's tended to be a fixed service into a household, but that's not a common grouping across particularly the central government public service agencies. And I'll come to that in the sort of forward-looking opportunity. Supply chain vulnerabilities are still a key issue around COVID. The availability of things like laptops and Chromebooks still remains quite a challenge. Cybersecurity, we saw, unfortunately, people taking advantage of COVID as a theme for new forms of phishing and other cyber attack. Addressing, I think, is a key issue. It became evident throughout our attempts to target households that actually the telcos in this country don't share even the most basic things like data standards or addressing standards. They use different formats and methods. It's very difficult to get some level of agreement here. And I would contrast that with, say, the electricity industry or utilities industry, where there is a quite formal register of households for things like electricity connection. The same thing does not exist for connectivity. And engagement, as we learned through the pilots, and I'm sure Arnika again will talk through this. This needs to be a community and iwi-led initiative around inclusion, and certainly doing that through lockdown was quite problematic. So throwing technology at people unannounced is not a method I would recommend. But needs must, I guess, when you're in these situations. And I'll just leave with this slide, I guess, which is looking at those newly connected households. While they have been provisioned primarily for distance learning purposes, and while we are yet to find a sustainable funding solution, we have managed to extend the internet connectivity in those households now through to February next year. And I'm still working on how we might find a way to extend that further. But I think this opportunity across a whole range of different, both public and private sector organisations, is something that we need to try and bring together in some way. This is not a burden that education can shoulder alone. But certainly for connectivity, there is an opportunity here to bring together all of those parties who have an interest, and potentially some who derive benefit from it. It's not lost on me that moving customer base into a digital channel is in fact quite a big cost saving for many of the government organisations. So we are thinking about and looking to how we bring that together collectively. So I'll end on that point.